Happy New Year. Barbara's loving that. No, Pastor Eric has not lost his marbles, at least not any more than usual. Today is the first Sunday in Advent, which is the start of a whole new year on the Christian worship calendar. Our common calendar begins in January, right? The government's begins in October, or at least it should. But the Christian year begins with the first Sunday of Advent, as we turn our hearts and minds toward Bethlehem, towards the imminent arrival of Jesus and to the promise of his return. This Advent, we'll be studying the 4 Advent candles and their messages of hope, love, joy, and peace. And today we begin by looking at our first candle and how it symbolizes hope. In 1981, Eugene Lang was invited to give the commencement address to 59 children who were the 6th grade class in PS 121 in Harlem, New York City. Lang was a highly successful businessman. His companies held the patents to a number of devices of the modern age, like ATMs, barcode scanners, and VCRs. PS 121 was a school in a predominantly African American and Puerto Rican neighborhood, with an average income well below national averages. And just before going on stage, he learned that statistically, nearly all of the class would never graduate high school. He realized these children weren't going to respond to his generic message of stay in school. There was no money at home for them to even think about college or any sort of training after school. Scrapping his notes, he decided to speak to them from his heart. He said, stay in school, and I'll help pay the college tuition for every one of you. At that moment, the lives of all of those students changed. For the first time, they had hope. One student said, I had something to look forward to, something waiting for me. And nearly 90% of that class went on to graduate from high school. Hope. It's essential for our well-being, spiritually as well as physically. A 2021 study by Harvard Medical School showed that among young adults with chronic illnesses, greater degrees of hope are associated with improved coping, well-being, and engagement in healthy behaviors. It also protects against depression and suicide. Among teens, hope is linked with health, quality of life, self-esteem, and a sense of purpose. Hope means life. Hope gives us a reason to shake off whatever comes our way. And hope is part of the core of the Christian faith. Each week in Advent, we light another candle. Each week, the light grows a little brighter, a little stronger, until the light of the world, comes at Christmas. And so I think it's fitting that the first candle is the candle of hope, because it is the first one to bring light into the darkness. It is the first ray of brilliance, speaking into the chaos and saying, no more. But what if you're still in the chaos? What if the darkness seems all too powerful? I know there are those among us who aren't convinced that one single candle can make a difference, or that there's any reason to hope in the midst of all that's going on in your lives. How can I hope, Pastor, with all this dragging me down? Our scriptures today speak into that reality. They aren't scriptures for a people already bursting with sunshine. They include messages to people in the gloom, wondering if this is all there is, if it's ever going to get any better. There's good news, God says. I will give you hope. Isaiah 11, from which our first reading is taken, is set at a very dark time in Israel's history. It was written when the Assyrian Empire, the most powerful in the region, was invading Israel. The king of Israel, Ahaz, had given up on trusting God and was trying to make it through on his own. Pause for a second. Does that sound like any of us? Trying to make it through on our own? Me, maybe? The natural state of humanity is this, right? That we're turning our backs on God, not trusting that God will be enough. It feels like so much of humanity today, doesn't it? King Ahaz saw that nation after nation had already fallen to the Assyrians, and the people were in fear. All they knew, all they had built, all they had was about to be destroyed. In Isaiah 11, God speaks to that fear and gives hope. God reminds the people that God had promised a descendant of David would always rule. And so in this vision that Isaiah shares, God reminds the people that what seems to be a dead stump, mown down by the Assyrian hordes, leveled, brought to earth, will bring forth new life. In Isaiah 11, this classic vision of Israel's ideal king, it's actually hope, nested within hope on top of hope. First, it reminds the people that God's promises will be fulfilled, that there will always be a king from the stump of Jesse. Second, it reminds in verse 2 that the Spirit of God would rest upon this king. And we know this prophecy came to pass by the shores of the Jordan River when John baptized Jesus and the Holy Spirit descended on Jesus as a dove. And third, verse 4 was important as a cultural word for the people. With righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. Throughout the ancient Near East, the mark of a truly righteous king was his willingness to protect the poor, the widows, the orphans. And the coming king will do all that as we see Jesus do that in his lifetime. There's a word in here we need to consider. With righteousness he shall judge the poor, or rule. We hear that word today in our society and it has a negative connotation to it, right? It makes us think of self-righteousness. The people who surveys say, our neighbors think we are. The people who are judgmental, looking down on others. But that's not what this word means at all. Righteousness is a state of being in right relationship with God. Being restored to wholeness with God. Of walking in God's path and of serving as God would serve. This coming king will be righteous. In other words, he will be in a right relationship with God. He will live in complete harmony with God. And of course, Jesus, as the righteous king, certainly fulfills this prophecy. Verses 6 through 9 continues. Once this king of righteousness is here, once righteousness is available, then peace and harmony will follow. Indeed, will spread throughout the whole world. Notice verse 10. For the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord. The nation shall inquire of him. In Hebrew, the word that's there, goyim, is not just nations as political groups, but all the peoples of the earth will inquire about him. And the coming Christ child will indeed fulfill all of those prophecies. Jesus, the descendant of David, restores us to be in right relationship with God. And word of the peace and harmony that follows from following Jesus has indeed spread throughout the world, just as Jesus told his followers to do, to go and make disciples of all the nations, all the peoples, thus fulfilling that last prophecy through us. But today isn't just about looking forward to the coming of the baby in Bethlehem as the fulfillment of all hope. It's also about reminding ourselves that hope lives also in our faith in Jesus' promise that he will come again at the end of the age to make right all that is still broken and to usher in the age of the new kingdom where God's people will be fully reunited with God. It's in that context of looking forward to the consummation of our hope that Matthew's gospel speaks today. In Jesus' time, it was hardly unheard of for people to try to figure out when the day of the Lord would come. Because since Daniel's time in the Old Testament, people had been looking to when God would usher in the fullness of God's kingdom. But right out of the gate, Jesus reminds us, it's not for us to know when that will be. And to me, that's important for a couple of reasons. First, it reminds us to not put our faith in anything other than God. And so when someone tells us that Jesus is coming on a certain date, we're right to be skeptical. Because if even Jesus doesn't know when the day is, how can I or anyone else? All the more, it reminds us of the need to be faithful, full of faith, that Jesus will return, even if we don't know the time. And second, it reminds us of the real lesson Jesus is teaching here. Even though we don't know when, we need to live like we're ready for it to be tomorrow. Look at what Jesus is teaching in verses 37 through 39. He talks about how life is going to be going on as normal, just as it always has, just as it does today, just as it always will. But it's the obliviousness of the people that catches my eye. In Noah's day, the people were clueless until the rains fell, Jesus says. Jesus is saying that same cluelessness applies in this day to the workers in the field and the women grinding their flour. I know people have long tried, and still do, to make these prophecies of Jesus in the various Gospels, try to make sense of them, to make them fit in today's world and today's events. Maybe they fit. Maybe they don't. But I don't think that's Jesus' point. I think Jesus wants to see instead how essential it is to be ready, to be fit for the kingdom, because the king may be coming at any time. And that's Jesus' point, I think, and he expresses it in verse 44. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. In fact, in the two verses just before that, Jesus uses the word watch 3 times. Our translation renders it as keep awake, but it's more with that sense of be on guard, be alert, be watchful. We're to watch, we're to be ready, and we're to be ready for a purpose, verse 44, so that when the kingdom comes, we're prepared. In the midst of our crushing disappointments in life, or our sense of being overwhelmed by life, in our anxieties and in our doubts, it can feel like hope is gone. But Matthew reminds us that hope still lives. Hope for the fullness of the kingdom. Hope for the restoration of all things. That hope has not abandoned us. And in faith, we know it never will. Isaiah spoke of a hope for the perfect coming king at a time when the people were outnumbered, surrounded, facing imminent defeat, hopeless in the face of the world. Isaiah 11 is the promise of hope that the perfect king is coming. That hope came true in a stable, in a little backwater town, in the form of a crying baby. The hope that seemed too good to believe in Isaiah's day, we know is real. For us, surrounded and perhaps hopeless in the face of the world today, a world that seems even less hospitable to God, Matthew 24 is the reminder of the hope that Jesus will return. The God that saw through the promise to Isaiah and to the people will see through to completion the promise to us. The kingdom is here, now, and is coming to full fruition. Of that we can be sure. And in that, we can have real hope. For God's greater glory. Amen.